Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. This is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I am your host, Olga Peters, and I want to welcome to the show regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro. Hi, Emily.
Hello, Olga.
And I also want to welcome Rep. Tiff Bluemle. We just practiced that and then my brain went completely empty. Thank you for joining us, Tiff. She is a representative from the Chittenden 6-5 district. And some may also know Tiff as the founder of Change Your Story, Change the Story. So glad you can be here today, Tiff. And today we're going to talk about legislation around establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which, as far as I understand, Emily, has passed the House and is now in one of the committees with the Senate. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. It was one of the many amazing bills that we got out in time for crossover this year and got sent over to the Senate. Yeah.
And Tiff, tell us a little bit about this legislation.
Well, it is a piece of legislation that grows out of the eugenics apology that we passed last year, which apologized for the General Assembly's role in eugenics policies and practices. And there was, we resolved at the end of that resolution a commitment to using legislative action to address the harm that had been caused, and not just that particular, the harm that was caused by eugenics, but the ripple effect of eugenics and what the eugenics movement actually meant, what it was grounded in, which was a belief system in kind of a hierarchy of being. And so at any rate, this was our committee's first commitment as a result of the apology.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tiff.
I believe when we passed the apology, we did a show on that.
Yes, we did.
Olga? We did. Okay, so if listeners want to go back to the Wayback Machine on our website, they can find the show on the eugenics apology. And that was an incredibly moving and powerful moment. And one of the things that I really, one of the reasons I wanted you specifically on here, Tiff, to talk about this, I know, you serve on the committee of jurisdiction that did the work on both the apology and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But really, I think pretty early in your service as a legislator, I remember you convening this conversation and really sort of thinking really deeply and struggling through in the best possible way with really fundamental questions of process with regards to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and even what an apology meant. And so I would love to even sort of start with that piece of like, what does it even mean to form a commission like that? And who are we to be doing that? And sort of all those big questions. Is that too big to jump right in with, Olga?
No. I mean, I think it's in some ways the most interesting aspect of the discussion about it, because anybody can read the bill and understand exactly what its pieces are and how we imagine it working, etc. But what I have found really an interesting exercise is to figure out what is the legislature's role and what is it not. And I've always known in my past work, good work is generally iterative, and it takes into account what is happening around one, and it needs to be informed by multiple perspectives. So where you think you may be going may not at all be where you need to go. And so the challenge in developing a commission was to try to figure out, well, how do you create a structure or provide a container that's strong enough and well supported enough to do this work and not dictate too much about how they're going to do that work. And I have found that legislators, we tend to like to spell that all out, and we, you know, and yeah. And so that, and it was, I think, a frustrating process for some, you know, to not know, and to not know exactly, well, what populations would be focusing on. The legislation identifies Indigenous Vermonters, people of color, and individuals and families living with disabilities. But the commission could decide that it wanted to take testimony from other groups that have been harmed by discriminatory processes or policies of the state. And it's a big job. The commissioners on this commission have a significant responsibility to chart a course that is informed by the voices that matter. And the voices that matter are not legislators. The voices that matter are the people in our communities who have been harmed, who have something to say. And hopefully what they have to say will help us better understand our history, not just eugenics, but our history, our impact as a legislature on different populations. And that will, I mean, that alone won't lead to erasing the harm or repairing it. But it's a step, it's a critical step in the process. And through that process, I anticipate that those participating in it will develop a better sense of, well, what would repairing the harm mean to them? And it's going to be different. And it's not going to be the same within any particular population either, because if you talk to different Indigenous Vermonters who have been active in providing testimony, they would define that differently. And that's so, and I think that what that means is then the next steps that are recommended through this commission will reflect what we're told and not what we've brainstormed around a table and think makes lots of sense. You know, and that's the way that a lot of groups or institutions do things, not just the legislature, but so it is a first step. And I, you know, I convene that group, Emily, because, you know, our committee was just a group of 11 people, and 11 people with a certain set of experiences. But I wanted to hear from my peers, a broader constellation of peers who were active in thinking about issues of equity and social justice, to help me think through what are the pitfalls, you know, in a process like this.
And the pitfalls of even, and to make it sort of what I think for me, the biggest pitfall that you started with, which is the legislature needs to initiate this in both as the harming party and in order to make this real, because we hold power. And so when we act, we often make things real. That's like what reify, basically like the definition of reify is like, you know, all wrapped up in legislative power. And so what does it mean for us, an incredibly privileged group of folks holding power, to initiate a process that's about repair and harm? And how do we do that in a way that's even like marginally inclusive, let alone fully inclusive of what people actually want? given that we have a process that really at every turn hinders meaningful participation. We have a lot of mechanisms for participation, but meaningful participation is so very different than testimony in a lot of cases.
Oh, that is so correct. Yeah. And I think, yeah, and that was part of the challenge too, right? Because we took a lot of testimony and listened hard to a range of people, including the International Center for Transitional Justice, which has worked, with 40 different truth and reconciliation processes across the world. And so we took this in, but ultimately we were the ones that decided, right? And I think, and so I hope that we have built in enough room for the voices that need to come to the fore to really have an impact on the direction that the commission takes and the work that it does, and how deep, how broad, they go. There were, as we've noted, there are a lot of different pitfalls, the one you just articulated, but obviously inclusion is another one, right? How do you include enough of the voices? Because we will, whether the commission will probably hold public hearings, it will probably organize small group discussions. It may even do one-on-one interviews with certain individuals, and that, but it won't reach everybody. And so so we're going to need the buy-in and the participation of folks in those affected communities to help do the outreach and identify the groups and the leaders with whom we ought to be talking. So
I think that's one pitfall, right? That we can't reach everyone. And that the idea that even when we use the word communities, it's really a stand-in for something that's not a community, right?
No.
So that pitfall. And then there's the other pitfall, which includes that first pitfall sort of includes this. I was working on a totally unrelated piece of legislation yesterday, and someone else on the committee sort of noticed that we had made a list and said, like, one of the first things I learned when I got here was, like, whenever you put a list in legislation, you're probably leaving something out and you shouldn't even try. And I was like, oh my God, I remember the moment in committee my first year where I learned that problem of the list, right? And then, so there's that, there's we can't be inclusive enough. And then there's sort of the other side of the pitfall, which is one of, is something I really struggled with thinking about the commission, was about being too wide to be able to go deep, right? What does it mean to just focus on eugenics? How, that seems to be incredibly broad, impacted folks, but are we just talking about descendants of people who experience eugenics in Vermont? Are we only talking about Indigenous Vermonters? There's a lot of people who experience eugenics in Vermont. Most people, when they think of truth and reconciliation, think of, mostly Black people. And so how does this all, how do you go deep with such totally people with really very different lived experiences and very different identities?
It's a great question, and one with which we wrestled a great deal. Where we ended up was in enabling the commission to form committees that would be composed of people who represent different communities or populations, and that there's intersectionality across those groups, but their lived experiences and the impact of policies like eugenics could be very, very different, and their willingness to talk about those experiences may be very, very different. And what they need from the state could be very different as well. And so that is why, I mean, it is not a kind of a mishmash monolithic approach, and that will be a challenge for the commissioners. And it is why we have funded it to the degree that we have. I mean, about $750,000 in this first appropriation, and we expect over 4 years to spend close to $5 million on it. Why? Because we believe that the commissioners need to be full-time staff. You know, I mean, not staff, but they need to be paid for their service, because you want continuity. You know, you don't want them to leave because they couldn't afford to do what they were doing. And you also want to respect the work. Secondly, there needs to be a director, a staff person who can handle all of the administrative responsibilities and do some of the outreach that's going to be important. And there may be research that is needed to fill in gaps, because we don't know all that we need to know about property access, you know, in the life of the state of Vermont, and who's had access and who hasn't. I mean, there are gaps. Anyway, so you know, I think that spending that kind of spending state resources on this signals this is important, it's a priority, and to underfund it would have been a huge mistake. And I'm really proud of the House for having committed itself to supporting it in this way. And it's just a first step, you know. There's a lot more social equity legislation that will hopefully follow, and not wait until the 3 years that the, you know, commission has to do its work, because things will bubble up and become obvious as a result of the work that they're doing, you know, along the way, which will prompt legislation. So
before we talk about what comes next,
sure.
Olga, it sounded like you had a question, and I have one too.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, I have a couple questions. I don't know which one should come first, but a couple things that are coming to the surface for me is, one, just kind of a practical question, is given how deep this work needs to be, does the commission have a lot of flexibility in how it wants to structure itself and its process going forward? And then the second one is, you know, this is, especially just taking eugenics as an example, for a lot of people, this is decades ago. And so I'm wondering what fell into place now, or what made it possible now for this legislation to happen?
Well, without a eugenics apology, without the history that was presented on the floor, and the 10 years that it took to get that passed, because there are lots of legislators who have heard about this apology for a long time
and who have sponsored it. Yeah, it's amazing how many different people have sponsored the eugenics apology over the decade until it passed. I think that's very
I
mean,
and
sad, but
you know, Vermont, I think, recognizes it has a lot of work to do. I think we have some extraordinary social equity leaders in Susanna Davis and Kaya Morris and others who have led the way in laying bare social equity deficits. And, you think about the experience with COVID, right? The racial disparities that were that existed during COVID in terms of access to vaccinations, information, language, translation of health directives, et cetera. I think that there is a new awareness about the need to think about these things more, and that we are way more diverse than we think we are. And obviously the racial reckoning that the nation has experienced over the last 2 years has been, I think, really helpful in making the case for something like this.
One thing that I really noticed sort of towards the racial reckoning this country has gone through, and I think part of why maybe the eugenics bill was possible to pass this last year, is when we sort of started doing way more sort of internal conversations about racism with the caucus, and like doing our own internal work as a caucus, and less about sort of what we were doing politically outside. It was really interesting to hear how many people said, like, my kids or my grandkids are the ones who have sort of, told me I need to like get it together, basically. I mean, there's like lots of different ways of, framing that and phrasing that, but it was really the intergenerational nature of this reckoning was very interesting for me to learn about and to participate in. I really appreciated that, especially given, like Tiff from Burlington, especially, but even just being from Brattleboro, like we both represent much more diverse places than the majority of the state. And so that's, to see sort of how people come to the need for this work has been really interesting.
Well, and also, I think that people, you think about what happened at Clemens Farm, and you think about I think we're constantly surprised by things that we read in the news, like, oh my God, really? Really? And you have to take seriously that we have a problem, and it's a problem that is nationwide. Vermont is not different, but we are whiter, and it is easier for us to kind of to imagine that we don't have the same kind of racial tension or inequities, because we don't have to see them all the time. Anyway, I guess this has been a long time coming. So I in some ways I was shocked that this was an 11-year-old apology, and that it took that long, because eugenics doesn't seem to me to be a controversial topic in that.
Apologize, being against eugenics doesn't.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes. That it's pretty easy to know where you stand on, or where one should stand on that issue. And I don't really understand what made it so difficult to get that apology through. But I think part of it is that was a long time ago. That, I mean, it's what you said earlier, long time ago. It's not, I didn't do this. And also maybe apologizing on having the General Assembly apologize for something that's kind of big, right? I mean, we're taking responsibility for ways in which we are culpable.
One thing that I continue to be struck by on this issue is the sort of party politics of it, in that, and I think I've said this on another time we were talking about Indigenous and Abenaki issues, Olga, but that because of sort of the nature of rurality in Vermont and politics and all these things, we have more Republican members that identify as having Indian blood, that's their language, not mine, than we do Democrat members. And so I think that creates this like really awesome opening for people to be able to participate in something that in a lot of other areas of the country can be, where racial conversations can be quite partisan. This sort of didn't start as a racial conversation. It started as a conversation about Vermont's history and Vermont's history with its Indigenous population. And so that's a piece of it that I sort of always try to come back to about sort of what it means for other kinds of change in Vermont, and how we bring lots of people into a conversation that might from the outside be like a national flashpoint issue.
I think that the experience of and the harm done to those with disabilities and families with members who are disabled, I think I don't think we know nearly enough about those stories and about and the stigma that continues to limit access to all sorts of things for people living with disabilities. And I am very hopeful that history will be a much bigger part of our conversation, because I think actually there's a lot of legislative action that we need to take to address the needs of people who live with disabilities, and the rate at which they are employed, what they earn, is startling. And we found that with the change of story reports that we were doing, and it's never really reported, so at any rate,
I think, in terms of even the very sort of base functionality of the eugenics system in Vermont, there's still tremendous pressure around sterilization and certain kinds of, about people's ability to raise their children or to maintain their pregnancies. If folks have significant mental health or emotional or physical disabilities. I mean, that's still baked into our Department of Children and Families procedures and policies. And that was one of the powerful things about the eugenics conversation, is sort of people who had witnessed that firsthand and were speaking to it.
And, who remember being at the Brandon facility, and, or who, at any rate, I'm sorry, it's haunting. It's really haunting, that part of the history. It's also haunting that, it's really hard to get many Indigenous folks to talk about the ripple effect that eugenics had in driving people underground and depriving them of opportunities to really celebrate their culture and their language and identify themselves. And that's, at any rate, it's going to be hard.
I think before we go to a break, I would just like to say, I feel like, Olga, we've done enough shows about this topic, and we've been working together for long enough that I'm going to say that usually Olga waits until the very end of one of these shows before she says aloud that her family, and like that she has this history in her own family. And so in the interest of sort of helping move us towards more honest conversations about it, I'm going to out you, Olga, and hope you forgive me, because we've been doing this together long enough, and you certainly usually say it, you just wait until the very end of the show. So
yes, I want to be very clear. I don't have my family's been impacted by eugenics, not to the level that many families were. I want to be very clear about that. I feel some families have much more horrific experiences than mine. And I also, as a child in elementary school, ran into some language that it wasn't until I was an adult I realized was kind of the language of eugenics. But what stands out for me with these experiences is, and maybe I've said this on the show, that I consider myself pretty basic, pretty middle of the road, pretty privileged in so many ways. And yet I can see the ripple effects in my family of these actions. And so if someone like me who is, you know, just pretty average, imagine someone whose family was deeply, deeply targeted and what they've experienced. And it just reminds me that when we do harm to members of our collective human community, it never stays. It's kind of like harm is a little bit like during the pandemic when everyone was like, okay, well, we're closing this border or we're closing this border, as if a respiratory virus was going to stop at a border. It's kind of the same thing with communities that we're like, okay, well, if we harm these people, that harm is just going to stay there. And it doesn't, it moves out. And I won't say that everyone is harmed equally or everyone's experiences are exactly the same, but it does kind of imbue all of us, and none of us can really say it only one person's hurt. Everybody's hurt. I'm not saying that very eloquently, but I think that's what my experiences taught me.
Yeah, that's very eloquent. And you know, as a former teacher, one that I just think about all the talent that was lost, you know, when all of that potential, like, what did we lose out on as communities? And I mean, there's lots more to that, but I just, you know, just thinking in, that's the great unknown, right? Is all of the all the people that might have written or painted or you know, made music, or all that we could have learned from in terms of the native culture here, and the respect for the land, and seeing, you know, life in every single thing, and it at any rate, it's a profound loss.
Yeah. Thank you, Tiff. Thank you, Emily. And of course, I am very happy you outed me, Emily. We are going to take a quick break and hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you are just joining us, I am speaking with Representative Emily Kornheiser and Representative Tiffany Bluemle, and I am your host, Olga Peters. You can also find us wherever you find your podcasts and on BCTV. So, Emily, what do we need to remind folks of?
Well, Olga, the thoughts and opinions and things that the people on the show say are those of the host and the guests, and not the radio station, nor the TV station, nor the broadcasting channel, nor anyone's employers, loved ones, or neighbors.
Thank you. Tiff, you were saying something really beautiful during the break, and I stopped you and I said, no, listeners need to hear this. And you were talking about how many moments in history things could have changed. And I'd love if you would revisit that for listeners.
Well, you had asked me about, we were commenting on how, this ripple effect on whole groups of people, families, as a result of eugenics. And that was making me think about the conflict between Rome and the Celts who saw God in everything, and God was alive, and they didn't need an intercessor to reach God. God was right there, present, and Rome won. And I've wondered, how might the world look really different had the Celts won out, or at least been allowed to, commingle and survive in their own interpretation. And I think that when we think about kind of the cost of, of slavery, of eugenics, of redlining, they run deep, and for generations, and that's heavy. That's heavy, and that will be, that makes the commission's work heavy.
So thank you, Tiff, for revisiting that.
So what exactly is the commission's work? I'm realizing that we have not talked about that part yet. And I love that our listeners have to wait until after the break to get to this part. Because this is a bill where sort of the process really is the product in a lot of ways. And I think it is helpful for our listeners to hear more about the product. So what are the tasks of the commission, and what do we think some of the results will be?
So, so the legislation doesn't pick the commission. There are 5 people that are named, 5 positions that are named in the legislation. They get together and choose a 7-member selection panel, and that selection panel will develop a process for selecting 3 commissioners, and that will be a public process in that anybody could apply to be a commissioner. They, the qualifications they're looking for will be the result of the conversations that 7-member selection panel has, and it will be informed through conversations with the communities that we've been talking about. And so at any rate, there will be, for finalists, an opportunity for the public to weigh in on individuals, which will be confidential, but made available to those who are selecting the commissioners. And then, so those commissioners, once selected, and ideally this would be by January of next year, or by March of the following year, they would then hire some staff, and then they make it up. And there are basically a few kind of parameters to their work. They must work with community members. That's articulated really clearly. They have to provide interim reports on what they're doing. They're given broad latitude, though, in how they do their work, and how they structure it, and who is involved. So and that's the part that we were talking about at the very top of this program, which is, it isn't appropriate for the legislature to decide, how they're going to work, because we could have lots of ideas that we think make a whole lot of sense to us, but actually don't work. For example, there are many Indigenous people who have told us, we don't want to go to a public hearing. That's not going to feel safe to many members of our communities. And so maybe there are other ways to draw us out, to tell our stories, and to think really concretely about what repairing harm means to us and what it would look like.
And so
Sorry. Yep.
No, I'm sorry. So they need to, the commissioners, once appointed, need to involve the community and provide interim reports. Is there sort of a guiding question that they're answering in their work? Or is it just the word truth and reconciliation?
So the idea is twofold. One, to explore the harm that has been done to these communities and possibly others, that has been state sponsored. And then secondly, to make recommendations based on what they have heard, based on the recommendations of others, about how the state might begin to repair that harm. And, you know, that pretty broad, right? And I think appropriately so.
And so,
And
go ahead, Olga.
sorry, go ahead.
You
Emily.
go ahead. I've been asking more of the questions than you.
I'm just listening so deeply. I'm so interested by this. How much like power will the commission have to, with its recommendations, to make sure the legislature, future legislatures, I should say, will act on them?
None.
None.
No
Right.
one. I mean, and we can't even do that if we want to. Like, we are not allowed to obligate future legislators.
Right.
Legislatures.
Here's the thing, though.
Anything.
We are investing money in this, and it will be very public. So I am assuming that there will be interest. There will be public pressure to follow this up, because this isn't, people have, I think that some of the reporting about this is called this like a study. It is not a study. It is a conversation. And
I love that differentiation.
Huh?
That's a really brilliant differentiation, and I really love it.
Well, thanks. I mean, it and it's the start of a conversation. And so, I mean, nobody wants a report that's going to gather dust on somebody's shelf. Nobody wants, this isn't, and let academics do the kind of academic research that is, you know, will shed lots of light. This isn't an academic enterprise. This is about better understanding our neighbors and their experiences as Vermonters, given the policies and practices that Vermont has had, that we've played a role in making, and that, you know, so it's a really, it's a personal thing, you know. I mean, hopefully it will be, and to that end, then no report can capture what that is. Hopefully the commission will come up with ways to tell these stories and make them more broadly available. And, you know, there can be exhibitions. There could be the Folk Life Center could be contracted to do some interviews that people could access in different ways. I don't know, but this is part of our living history. It's not the past. It's there is a there are events in the past or policies in the past that matter, but really what matters is what has people's experience been, and how is it lived out today?
I have two very, very different questions, ideas, thoughts, things to say right now. One is sort of just in this, to devolve a bit to the actionable. I'm imagining that if we're both in the legislature, once this is moving, that when those sort of interim reports come out, we'll both be sort of mining them for like legislation, right? And then there'll be a few people in the State House who are sort of regularly doing that and looking for what are the legislative opportunities to make amends or make repair. And so I think, as you said, like there'll be spots along the way before they finish their work, if it can ever be finished, that there'll be, opportunities to do more things. We don't have to wait until that happens. The other thing is just, I spent a lot of time for previous work in South Africa. And to just, was able to see how incredibly powerful it is when an entire country goes through a really meaningful truth and reconciliation process. And how I could really see in my time there, which was sort of pretty long, this was just 10 years ago I spent time there. So it was well after their commission had finished its work. But I could see in my everyday time there that there was both these incredible opportunities for truth telling woven into both everyday culture and just like tourism, right? Like there was just so many opportunities for people to interact with and reconcile themselves to what had been and what had happened and what that meant for today. And so that history was sort of this living, breathing part of everything we did there, as you were sort of describing, Tiff. And then the other part is that what it means for a community when legislation with these huge policy changes that South Africa took on, how those are so differently possible when a community has had a broad conversation about what's necessary. When those legislative and policy changes aren't something that are being done by one population to another part of the population, but there's something that everyone has had to reckon with through narrative and through conversation and all those things you're describing, Tiff, before the legislative action happens, and how different that is for so much of how we've been attempting repair work legislatively in this country. I feel like thus far, so much of the racial repair work in this country is in some ways by necessity, often a smaller group of people saying, we've seen this truth, we know this truth is self-evident for anyone paying attention, and so we're going to act on it because we can't wait anymore. But that leaves behind this group of folks who I think in some cases really genuinely don't understand why we're engaging in any kind of racial repair. And I don't, in America right now, I'm not saying I think things could be any different, and I don't think we can wait for justice until like everyone is calling for it. But I think there's something there.
But that's a really interesting point, Emily, because we've talked about how do we get as many voices to the table, and the voices of those who have directly experienced the harm or the ripple effects, or still living with the harm. And yet there is also the group of people who may not understand or not see how their lived experience is impacted or impacts others. And yeah, how do we bring folks in that group along as well is an interesting conundrum too.
And hopefully that's a big part of the work of the commission and all who will be informing that work and influencing it. Because ideally, I mean, it's the commission isn't just doing this, like, we have to own it, right? And it enriches us. Like, a lot of people don't want to own parts of history that are painful or make us embarrassed, instill shame. But it is always better to know that history and to have reckoned with it. We are closer. We can be closer as community members when we do. And because we understand one another better. And, you think about the gay rights movement. I'm a lesbian and I, people will say that the gay rights, is when people all of a sudden had relatives coming out, that all of a sudden it made them think, oh, well, Stevie can't get married. It doesn't seem really fair. I love Stevie, and he and his partner, they should be able to get married. Well, I just think that it's a way of it's connecting us. This history, this process, ideally will connect us with one another in new ways and with people we don't know. And I think we will be stronger for it. Something like this, critics of truth and reconciliation fear that it will tear communities apart, that it will be divisive, inherently divisive. And I think that not telling these stories and not grappling with it is what is most divisive.
I agree.
So, agreed. Yeah. Thank you, Tiff. That was really beautiful.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you both.
We have just a few more minutes before we need to go, and we've dug into a lot of different places. So I just want to touch base. Is there anything we want to leave listeners with, or want to make sure they know before we?
I think I want to thank everybody who came to testify before our committee and was patient with our process, because it was a long one and it was a hard one too. And I hope that what we came up with is will draw on the talent and the expertise that came before our committee. I also really want to extend a lot of gratitude for the work that the International Center for Transitional Justice gave to us. I mean, we did a full day and a half of training with them. Their written materials about truth and reconciliation processes are great, and they helped sharpen our focus and also understand what it is we needed to define in our legislation and what we needed to just leave alone. And
we include a link to them in our show notes, Olga?
Yeah. Yep.
And
they're easy to find.
What's the bill number?
96.
Thanks.
H96.
Yep. And I'll put a link to that too.
And not to reference other podcasts on our podcast, but
oh no, we definitely should.
One of the leads or directors or something from that International Center did a really good episode with Krista Tippett on being. about a year ago, maybe, that I would highly recommend folks take.
Oh,
Neat.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
well, and our
Um,
legislative, the training that was provided by ICTJ is streamed on our, our committee YouTube channel. And
great.
it, I believe, is February the 8th, 9th. And that it explains the framework, both for truth and reconciliation and reparations. And I highly recommend it. They are very, very thoughtful and skilled.
Thank you. Tiff, Emily, thank you for joining us. Emily, would you like to do the quick toast? Send our show out on a toast?
Yeah. My coffee mug that doesn't even have water in it anymore, let alone coffee. It's like a thrilling toast we have here. So I would like to toast to how Tiff especially, but many more people like Tiff, reckon so deeply with what it means to hold power.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Everyone have a wonderful weekend. We will be back next week. In the meantime, you can find us wherever you find your podcasts, on our Facebook page. And Emily, remind us what your page is.
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you'll find links to all my social media accounts, email contact, phone number, and my weekly office hour Zoom link.
And Tiff, you have a webpage as well, I believe.
I do, tiffbluemle.com. But
Wonderful.
I would not recommend going to that website because I am working on it. I really haven't done very much. Emily is actually pretty much my model of what to do with a website. Well, and many other things, but
We can stop there.
Anyway.
Okay, so thank you for coming on, Tiff.
Thank you, Tiff.
for having me.
Take care, everybody.